On the night Argentina won its first World Cup, the Monumental Stadium shook with celebration. Just over 10 blocks away, people held in the ESMA detention center could hear the roar through the walls. Some were blindfolded, some were shackled, and many would never leave alive. Outside, a country watched Mario Kempes lift football toward immortality. Inside, a military dictatorship was disappearing its opponents and trying to convince the world that Argentina was peaceful, united, and proud. The 1978 World Cup was not simply played under a dictatorship. It became one of the regime's most polished performances. Argentina had been awarded the World Cup years before the generals seized power, but by 1978, the tournament belonged to their political moment. After the coup of March 1976, the junta led by Jorge Rafael Videla built a system of censorship, kidnapping, torture, and forced disappearance against people it labeled subversive. The terror was designed to be felt everywhere and seen nowhere, leaving families to search for sons, daughters, and spouses who had simply vanished. For the regime, the World Cup offered a rare instrument. Millions of visitors, foreign cameras, packed streets, and a national emotion powerful enough to drown out doubt. It declared the tournament a matter of national interest and created EAM 78, an agency that centralized stadium construction, broadcasting, security, and public image. Football would provide the lights, the music, and the crowds. The state would try to control everything outside the frame. The project was expensive, secretive, and immense, with new infrastructure and television facilities built to show a modern nation to the planet. Official language promised harmony, order, and a shared Argentine destiny, while criticism from abroad was denounced as an anti-Argentina campaign. Behind those promises, police and military power remained close enough to enforce the version of Argentina being displayed. Public relations specialists pushed slogans that turned every supporter into a player for the country, making loyalty feel like a duty rather than a choice. In Paris, a state-backed counter-information office worked to answer human rights accusations and to monitor the exile networks raising them. Exiles turned football's calendar into a deadline for testimony, organizing across Europe before the first whistle. But the tournament also gave those networks a global audience they had never possessed before. The same cameras the junta hoped to choreograph would bring foreign reporters to mothers who had spent months asking where their children were. The cup became both the regime's shield and the narrow opening through which its victims could be heard. On June 1st, as the World Cup opened, the mothers of Plaza de Mayo made their regular Thursday walk around the square in front of the presidential palace. They wore white headscarves and carried photographs, insisting on the names of the disappeared at a time when public grief itself could be dangerous. Dutch journalists filmed and interviewed them, and Dutch television placed their testimony beside coverage of the opening ceremony. For viewers abroad, the immaculate stadium spectacle suddenly had another Argentina beside it, anxious women searching for relatives the state denied taking. No national team withdrew from the tournament, and Amnesty International did not call for a boycott, but the campaign around the cup made silence harder to maintain. The regime had invited the world to admire Argentina. The mothers used the invitation to ask the world to look closer. On the field, Cesar Luis Menotti built a side that played with elegance, aggression, and an unmistakable belief that Argentina could finally win at home. Mario Kempes became its brilliant, restless forward, running from deep positions with long hair flying and a fierce need to score. The players were not the authors of the dictatorship, and the crowds who loved them were not one political body. Football's joy was real even inside a controlled country, yet every victory gave the regime images it could borrow: flags, unity, obedient streets, and the appearance of a nation with nothing to hide. After a tense first phase, Argentina entered the final group, needing a huge win over Peru to reach the final ahead of Brazil. That requirement would produce the tournament's most enduring sporting suspicion. Argentina defeated Peru 6-0 on June 21st, exactly the margin it needed to advance. The result has generated decades of allegations involving pressure, diplomacy, grain shipments, and political interference. After the final whistle, the score became a political fact as much as a sporting one. What historians can say responsibly is narrower. The match remains controversial, the allegations remain disputed, and no conclusive public finding has proved that Peru deliberately threw it. The absence of proof did not silence suspicion. It made it endure. For the men in Argentina's dressing room, the result meant one thing: the final was theirs to play. For critics, it became another reason to ask what power could do when a government treated a football tournament as a national mission. The question followed Argentina into the final, but it never erased the fact that an exhausted Dutch team still stood between the hosts and history. History preserved the result, and the doubt beside it. On June 25th, the Netherlands walked into the Monumental under a sky of paper streamers, noise, and military ceremony. Kempes scored first, the Dutch equalized late, and for a moment the entire performance seemed ready to collapse into dread. Outside the ground, radios carried each shift in the score through streets already prepared to erupt. Then Argentina found another gear in extra time, with Kempes scoring again before Daniel Bertoni sealed a 3-1 victory. The stadium became a flood of blue and white, and Videla appeared before cameras as the captain received the trophy. Argentina's skill and the surrounding ceremony became inseparable in the images sent abroad. That night, celebrations burst across Argentina with a force no political script could completely fake. Yet near the finals stadium, prisoners at ESMA heard the same triumph from a world that had almost no idea they were there. That contrast is why the victory still resists a simple reading. ESMA was one of the dictatorship's largest clandestine detention centers, where thousands of people were held, and most remained disappeared. Survivor testimony describes captives hearing the tournament and, in at least one account, watching part of Argentina's match against Peru in the basement before returning to captivity. Families outside the system continued asking questions that official broadcasts could not answer. This is the image at the heart of 1978, a goal celebrated in a stadium while state terror continued a short distance away. It does not mean every fan knew, approved, or could safely speak. Dictatorships survive partly by isolating people from the full truth and by punishing those who insist on it. Survivors later made those hidden spaces part of the country's public memory. It does mean the World Cup's brightness was useful to a state that wanted its violence hidden behind a national story of normality. Glory did not create the horror, but it gave the regime a glittering surface on which to project innocence. Memory made the silence visible long after the crowds were gone. The dictatorship celebrated the cup as proof that Argentina was admired, orderly, and united. But the victory did not solve the crisis of legitimacy it hoped to escape. Foreign reporting, exile campaigns, and the Mother's weekly marches had pushed the disappeared into the international conversation. The tournament showed the power of sport to generate real belonging, but also the power of governments to place themselves beside that belonging and claim it as their own. That is why the story cannot be reduced to a villainous team or a guilty crowd. Menotti's players won a football tournament through talent and nerve. The regime tried to turn that human achievement into evidence for a political lie. Its propaganda could borrow the celebration, but it could not make the disappeared vanish from history. Argentina's first World Cup remains one of the most emotional moments in the country's sporting memory, and it belongs to players and supporters as much as to any ruler who tried to stand beside it. But memory has to hold two pictures at once: Kempes running through the rain of paper, and the disappeared whose absence haunted the country beyond the stadium lights. Neither image cancels the other, and neither can be understood honestly alone. The tournament did not expose every crime in real time, and it did not end the dictatorship, which lasted until 1983. What it left behind was a warning about spectacle. A beautiful event can be real and still be used to make an ugly system look acceptable. History asks us to protect joy from the people who would use it as camouflage. The roar from the Monumental reached people the regime wanted erased. That is why Argentina 1978 is not only the story of a World Cup won under a dictatorship, but of the truth that kept speaking through the noise. That demand still survives every replay and generation.